Hi, everyone. Welcome to another workshop presented to you by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis, and I'm one of the faculty here at the Writing Support Center. And today we're going to be talking about style. So before we get started, I just want to share a couple of expectations on how to get the most out of this workshop. So to get the most out of this workshop, we recommend that you complete the accompanying activity worksheet. You can find this worksheet in the module in which you access this workshop. If you are completing this workshop for extra credit or a class assignment, you do need to complete that worksheet in order to get credit. And also, we recommend that you take your time. Feel free to pause and rewind the parts that were confusing or went too fast. The beauty of having these workshops pre-recorded is that you get to choose how quickly and how slowly you want to take in the information. So a little bit of an outline of what today's discussion is going to look like. So we're going to go over what we mean by style, how are we defining style, and how do we fix it? And we're going to be looking at strategies for improvement, particularly focusing on wordiness, verb trouble, and ostentatious irritation, which is basically means using big words in your writing. And then lastly, we're also going to be looking at editing. How do we edit and how do we work on improving our style of writing? So what is style? Style looks at the way that you put together a sentence or a group of sentences. This is very subjective because it looks at how readers interpret your reading or your writing, and different disciplines have different style preferences. So, for example, if you're writing a paper for the STEM disciplines, those types of writing tend to be a little more straightforward. Whereas when you write for something like English or literature, you might be encouraged to use longer, more flowery sentences. So it's very subjective, and you are going to be asked to change your style depending on the discipline that you are in. And then also different instructors have different interpretations of what they determine as good style. The goal is not to imitate style, but rather to get your point across in a very straightforward way with an appropriate tone for the discipline. So even though you're reading a lot of academic articles, just know that you never have to feel pressure to imitate that style. Rather, you are learning how to communicate your ideas in an effective way. So to start off, we're going to start with the reflection. You can complete this activity in the accompanying worksheet that is found in the module. And for this reflection, we're going to ask you to go back to one of your old papers. You can choose any paper where your professor left comments. And so for your reflection, I want you to think about what kind of comments did they leave? Did they primarily focus on content? So things such as the thesis, quote integration, paragraph structure, etc. Did they primarily focus on sentence structure or grammar and mechanics? Write your response in the space provided on the worksheet. So strategies for improvement. So in order to start improving on your style when you're writing, we need to first start off by figuring out what are your most common style errors. Hence why in the reflection activity, I had you look at the comments that your previous professors have left. Your professors will often comment on different things about style, if there's something that was awkward, if there was wordiness that was happening, etc. But we really need to know how to recognize those errors. The reason it's important to go back to your old writing and learn from it is because your choices are deliberate and they influence the way others interpret your writing. So every decision that we make in regards to how we put our sentences together is going to influence how the reader interprets and reads your work. Instructors typically look at wordiness, verb tenses, and your your word choice, how you are using your diction, and whether the words that you are choosing make sense in the sentence that in the context that is provided. Um, just keep in mind that you may not have issues with all of these, but you want to focus on what appears most in your writing, and you want to focus on improving that aspect. So to start off, we're going to look at wordiness, which is using more words than necessary. It happens naturally when we speak. You know, we always feel like we have to repeat something multiple times in order to have others understand what we are saying. I know it happens to me a lot of the times, but because sometimes we unintentionally write the way we speak, it also ends up appearing in our writing. Um, so we'll end up saying the same thing twice because we feel like we need to get that point across, even though that's not always necessary. This can often happen as a result from uncertainty about the topic. Maybe you're still developing your argument, or maybe you don't have enough evidence to support the point that you are making. And so then the writing becomes a reflection of your thought process, which is 100% okay. That is actually what we call free writing, and it's a method of learning, and it's a method of getting our ideas onto the page and see what else we need to develop. So it's actually a great brainstorming technique. However, for the final paper, you do want to make sure that you are clarifying the point, you are adding why you believe about that, why you believe the point that you are making, and you want to make sure that you are adding evidence that supports your position. So when you're editing, those are the things that you want to look at if you find yourself repeating the same thing over and over again. Cliches, qualifiers, and redundant words are often common examples of what wordiness looks like in a paper. And on the next slide, we're going to go over what these look like and how you can identify and fix them. So a cliche often refers to a phrase that is overly used. So a lot of people say that there's a lot of truth in cliches, and while that is true, it becomes a little boring and redundant to read. So an example of a cliche is France bit off more than than it could chew. The phrase "more than it could chew" is a sample of a cliche. So when you want to fix it, you really want to think about how do you add in more precise description. So you really want to answer the why or the how. You want to be as specific as possible in your writing, and whenever we are sounding vague or redundant, half of the time it's because we are missing that precise description. So we can easily change this sentence from France bit off more than it could chew to the French faltered in Vietnam. And so now we know, now we have more information, and we know how France failed in this context. The next example of wordiness is often through the use of qualifiers. So qualifiers are adverbs such as very, often, really, etc. And they tend to they tend to try to add more description, but they're actually not adding a lot of description because they are vague words. And so you really want to make sure that you are only using one qualifier to add a more direct point. Again, we want to make sure our writing is as clear and straightforward as possible, and qualifiers sometimes take that away. Uh, so an example of a sentence that is using a lot of qualifiers is most people usually think that many puppies are generally very cute. So the words most, generally, very, many, all of those are qualifiers, and they are adding one too many adverbs to the sentence. So instead, again, you want to use one qualifier for a more direct point. And so we can change that previous sentence to most people think puppies are cute. It's more direct and straightforward, and as a result, it just makes it easier for the reader to understand your point. Lastly, a last example of wordiness is redundancy. So redundancy is again when we're using very vague terms to try to express our point. We always want to be as specific as possible whenever we're writing our essays. So an example of redundancy in a sentence is Adrian fulfilled all of our hopes and dreams when to save the whole planet. So this sentence, the concept of hopes and dreams, saving the entire planet, it's very vague. It doesn't provide a lot of description. So we want to make sure that we choose the most precise term and delete the one that isn't as precise. So the sentence now becomes Adrian fulfilled all of our hopes and dreams when she saved Adrian fulfilled all of our hopes when she saved the planet. So hopes was the more precise term, so that was the term that we decided to keep. Another common style issue that we see is verb trouble. So this often appears through the use of passive voice, nominalization, and weak verbs. So passive voice is if you're very familiar with grammar terms, it refers to the use of the to be verbs, and it makes it difficult for the reader to decipher your meaning. So passive voice is often used when you're utilizing a lot of the to be verb, and it'll often remove the subject as the main actor of a sentence, and it makes the sentence sound a little convoluted. Uh, Likewise, weak verbs also make it difficult for the reader to decipher your meaning. Weak verbs are often just very vague, general. They don't give a lot of precise action as to what is happening in the sentence. So we always want to substitute them with a stronger verb. Um, some strategies on how to fix this. So for passive voice, we always recommend that you go back through your essay, circle all of the to be verbs, which are am, is, was, were, be, been, and being. If it's next to another verb. So for example, if you say she will be going to the store, um, will be going would be part of that to be passive voice. So you would circle that. And then we would try to see, okay, how can we replace that will be going with a stronger verb um, so that way your reader has a more direct understanding of what is happening in the sentence. Uh, Nominalization refers to when you turn a verb into a noun. So for example, instead of saying discovering, you say the discovery, or uh, res this results in rather than, or the result is rather than resulting. So nominalization is when you turn those verbs into a noun, and this is actually very common to see in academic writing because a lot of academic articles use this, and it's okay to use it at times, but you want to make sure that you're varying it. You don't want it to be in every single sentence, because then again it makes your sentences sound a little roundabout, and it makes it a little confusing for your reader to understand what it is you were trying to say. And then for weak verbs are similar to passive voice, where you're using the to be and have verbs in order to express a point. But again, those verbs tend to be a little vague. And so we always encourage that you find those verbs and replace them with a verb that describes precisely what your subject is doing. So again, just adding stronger verbs into your sentences in order to give a more direct line of thought. So some examples of verb trouble. So for passive voice, an example would look like the alien remains were lost, the car was wrecked. If we switched it over to active voice, we will notice that we took out the were and the was because those were the passive voice examples that we had in that first sentence. So once we took it out and we put that main verb as the primary action, the sentence just flows a lot more straightforward, and it's more direct. So, for example, the active voice sentence reads, "The government lost the alien remains. I wrecked the car." Um, so we put the government at the beginning of the sentence. We really wanted to focus on lost as the primary action that was occurring, um, in order to get that direct thought. Uh, for nominalization, so once again, nominalization refers to a verb being used as a noun in a sentence. So an example of that looks like the discovery of aliens was made by the government. We want to focus on changing that noun back into a verb to, again, just have a more straightforward sentence. So then we have a sentence that reads, "The government discovered aliens." So when you're going through your paper, you just want to make sure that you identify where you're using nouns that could actually be verbs and seeing if you can change the sentence around a little bit so that way the verb is actually functioning as a verb. And then lastly, an example of weak verbs is the aliens have a positive effect on our ecosystem. So again, when you're using a to be or a have verb, it just creates something that's a little vague. So you just want to add in something that's more precise. What is the positive effect? You know, we can say the aliens improve our ecosystem. So now we have something that's just more precise, more straightforward, which just leads to cleaner writing. Ostentatious erudition. So this is when you're using collegiate sounding words in a sentence, or in your writing. So this often happens because we want to mimic what we think sounding smart is. So we often associate the use of big words as like, oh, that person is really intelligent. So we want to add that into our writing to make sure that our writing sounds like college level writing. But the issue is that sometimes this can backfire because if you're using a word that you've never used before, you're not 100% sure of what the definition is or how to use it in a specific context. It might actually show that you don't understand the word. And so it will cause some confusion in your writing. It'll just make it unclear. It might uh, be a little bit of a shock. It might make your professors think that you're trying to plagiarize something. Um, so you just want to make sure that you understand the definition of a word before you use it and that you also check how it's used in a sentence. So that way you can ensure that you're using the word correctly. One thing that I always tell students is that it's actually more important to demonstrate and understanding and having your ideas come out clearly rather than sounding smart, because professors are really just looking at how well you're explaining a certain topic or a certain idea or a certain argument and how well you're defending it. So using those big collegiate words is not always the best way to demonstrate that understanding. So just focus on making sure that your ideas are coming out straightforward, they're clear, they're understandable, you're supporting your main ideas, and adding in um, these new words that you're learning here and there, but making sure that you understand and you know how you're using them. So double check a dictionary, double check to see how it's used in a sentence. All right, so editing. So when we're going through editing, we we've learned about the common issues, but now we want to see, okay, how do I fix them? One thing is that you want to make sure that you're focusing on one style issue at a time. So you may not have all of these issues present in your writing, but if you do, it's a lot of work to try to do them to try to fix them all at once. So you want to make sure that you're focusing on one at a time, just so that way you're able to really practice and hone in on one before moving on to another. This will help you just have a clear understanding. It'll help you learn how to locate the error in your paper, and be able to identify it much more clearly. And it just prevents a scattered approach to your writing. The locate and correct. So this strategy was mentioned a little bit when we were talking about wordiness, but this is the strategy that I recommend as one of the better strategies on how to fix your style. It's where you go through the paper and find where the style issue is occurring, and you focus on fixing it using some of the strategies that we talked about earlier. Um, and so this may take a little longer, but again, we're focusing on bettering one before moving on to another. Um, and so, yeah, just go through, focus on one thing. So if you're focusing on trying to find all of the examples of where you are using cliches, then you would go through your paper and see, am I using a cliche? How do I fix it? And then add in those more specific descriptors of how or why something is occurring. So now that we've talked about editing, we've talked about some strategies on how to identify common style issues and how to fix them. Go back to the old paper that you reflected on earlier. Select one of the style issues to focus on, so wordiness, verb trouble, or ostentatious erudition. And use the locate and correct method to go through the paper and find examples of where the errors occur. How do you fix those errors? And be sure to write your response in the space provided on the worksheet. All right. So to sum it up, style is very subjective and it happens to everyone. We're always changing our writing style depending on what we're reading, what we're learning, and the discipline that we are in. Most common style issues include wordiness, verb trouble, and ostentatious erudition. To better your style, focus on one issue at a time by using the locate and find method to find the most common issues and work on fixing them. And really focus on like what the strategies are that we've discussed in order to fix those issues. So thank you everyone for watching. And if you ever have any questions on on style, if you want additional support on how to find verb trouble in your essay, or if you want to confirm that you're using certain words correctly, we always welcome you to come to the Writing Support Center. We are open Monday through Thursday from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. and on Fridays from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Our tutors would be more than happy to help you. Thank you.